Good afternoon. Welcome to Jenifer Niles' lecture. I would like to introduce briefly but warmly our speaker. This is not the first time that Jenifer is with us. It was 2017 when she presented her work on the Sauroptonos Apollo here in the same room. So I'm happy to have Jenifer back for another presentation, another seminar on rereading the West Pediment of the Parthenon. Jenifer Niles is a very well-known American classical archaeologist, and since 2017, she is the director of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, and I have to add that she is the first woman in charge with this direction. And formerly, she was the Elsie Smith Professor in Liberal Arts in the Department of Classics at Case Western Reserve University. She was trained in the US at the Bryn Mawr College, and then she moved to Australia, to Sydney, and she ended at Princeton for the PhD. She is part of a team excavating in Etruscan site, for instance, here in Tuscany, Appoggio Civitate. It's nice to have you back also for this reason. But she was also part of the important excavation works in Morgantina in central Sicily. She was professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and then she moved to Cleveland as director of the Cleveland Museum of Art, and then in the faculty of Case Western Reserve University. She was also appointed visiting professors in many other places, like the University of California, Berkeley, and Johns Hopkins University. She's a real authority on the art of ancient Greece, and specifically her works first on iconography. The first time I met Jenifer was at Villa Spellman for a fantastic conference on the Francois vase, since one of the first publications of Jenifer Niles is The Youthful Deeds of Theseus, published for Breschneider in 1987. I can add also her involvement with exhibitions, and I would like to quote, to mention two important exhibitions she did. The first, the Goddess and Polis, the Panathenaic Festival of Ancient Athens in 1992. And the second one in 2003, Coming of Age in Ancient Greece, Images of Childhood from the Classical Past. She has received many fellowships and grants from different foundations and universities, and she's one of the main experts on the Parthenon. As many of you remember our fantastic visit with Jenifer at the Parthenon room years ago during our visit in Athens. She published two books on the Parthenon, and I would like to remember The Parthenon from Antiquity to the Present. This is 2005, and then two very recent contributions. The first one is The Cambridge Companion to Ancient Athens, just appeared, and we are waiting for a new book, so you can understand how extensively and intensively Jenifer Niles published From Callias to Critias, Art in Athens in the second half of the 5th century. I would like to welcome back Jenifer and leave the podium for her presentation on rereading the West Pediment of the Parthenon. Thank you, Jenifer.
Thank you very much, Professor Adornato. I am delighted to be back in this same salone to speak on a different topic and to see many of you whom I saw recently in Athens. And I hope you'll come back while I'm still there. I have one more year. And we'd be happy to have you come. Today I'm going to talk about the West Pediment of the Parthenon. And I'm going to suggest some new identifications of some of the figures on this pediment. As you know, of course, the East Pediment shows the birth of Athena, and we're told that this is the strife of Athena and Poseidon. Now, the story starts, well, I think that's forward. No. Maybe I'm doing the wrong button. No. I have it on, I believe, don't I? I did turn it on. Yes, it's on. I should say hello to the virtual audience out there. Maybe it's out of batteries. Oops, no. Now it's on. No. If you like, I can move to the table and shoot from there. Anyway, the story begins with a large snake. A big black 1.4 meter snake appeared outside the balcony of my apartment in Athens a number of years ago. And I quickly closed the windows, the shutters, and went over to the American School and told everyone there was a large snake that had come to visit me. And they teased me and said, oh, it's the Agathos daimon come to visit you. And they didn't believe me. And I said, no, honestly, there is this huge snake, and I would really like to get rid of it. What can we do? And they said, well, call your landlord, which I did, and told him, and he didn't believe it either. And he said, anyway, I'm in Evia, on a Greek island, so he couldn't help. So I was kind of desperate at this point. And luckily, then my telefonino rang, and it was this woman, and she said, are you the lady with the snake? And I said, yes. She said, well, my son will be right over to take care of it. He turns out he was a herpetologist. And he came over, and by then the snake wasn't visible. He jumped off the balcony. He rooted around underneath with the leaves, and he came up with this huge snake around his arm. And he said, well, this is a boring snake. I said, well, maybe it's boring to you, but what is it? He said, it's from the mountains. It works now? Okay, let's try. There he is. He said, it's from the mountains, and I'll take it back. And I thanked him very much. But at the time I was working on this particular vase, here's a detail of the Pelahydria, where we see a young boy with a snake wrapped around his neck, and he is blowing the salpinx. So I was writing an article, actually, about the salpinx, the war trumpet, and the original identification of this figure was as sort of a personification of the noise of battle. That's what various Greek scholars had said. And I said, that's not quite right, because a snake is always associated with heroes. So this must be some kind of hero, but who is this hero on the vase? Well, I eventually figured out that he was the hero of Salamis, and he was a snake hero. He was associated, his mythology, with various snakes. His name is Cyprius, and you don't find him mentioned very often anywhere in the literature, but he's definitely the hero of Salamis, and that's his name. So I have an article about this. In fact, I wrote it for Hesperia when I became the director of the American School. It dawned on me that I had never published an article in the Journal of the American School of Classical Studies, so I thought I'll publish it there. Anyway, you know, just an obvious example of the association of snakes with heroes are on these banquet hero reliefs, where they're often even feeding the snake. And I could cite many examples from other places like Sparta and elsewhere, but definitely the snakes are very much associated with heroes. So I'm going to talk a lot about snakes today. Starting with the pediments of the Parthenon, the Acropolis, I should say. From the earliest times, there's a clear preference for snakes on the Athenians' temples on the Acropolis. The limestone Hecatompedon, which was constructed in 560, features in one pediment, as I'm sure you know, this Triton being wrestled by Heracles, and this enigmatic monster here in the lower right in the east pediment, which we call Bluebeard, because we really don't know who he is. But you can see that his triple torsos terminate in 3 entwined snake appendages. And the corners of the opposite pediment were filled with the undulating snakes that you see in the upper left, flanking the central composition. The old Athena Temple of around 500 displayed a striding Athena in the pediment attacking a giant, and in her left hand she clutches one of the many snakes around her aegis. This predilection for snakes continued unabated into the classical period, and a large snake served originally as a support for the Nike, but you see it there in the shield on this Roman copy of the Athena Parthenos by Phidias, and I'll come back to that later. So the Parthenon's pedimental sculptures carries on this theme in the West. So here I'm going to present 2 new identifications for 2 male figures closely associated with snakes in the West pediment. I don't have a pointer, but you'll see details in a minute. And I'll subsequently argue for some new readings of other subsidiary figures who are witnessing this dramatic central narrative, namely what Pausanias identified as the strife between Athena and Poseidon. The West pediment is the earliest surviving pictorial representation of this contest, although I should say, as an aside, that some black figure fragments have been identified as this, but I don't agree with that. And the earliest literary reference we have to this dispute appears in Herodotus, Book 855, in his discussion of the olive tree on the Acropolis, which was burned by the Persians. Now, we'll begin with this famous group called BC, B/C, two figures carved from a single block of Pentelic marble. This has remained on the Parthenon's West pediment for over 2.5 millennia and was just only, well, relatively recently brought down. I'll come to that in a minute. This group appears in the famous drawing by the Flemish artist, maybe not Jacques Carré, but in 1674. And it was first identified in 1676 by Spahn and Weller as a Roman replacement representing Hadrian and his wife Sabina. It was for this reason that Lord Elgin refrained from including it in his otherwise wholesale looting of the Parthenon sculptures. At that time, B and C still had their heads, as we see in Parr's drawing of 1765. These were lost by 1803, although the head of B, the male figure, was said to be in the collection of Edward Dodwell. But John Camp, who's done a lot of work on Dodwell, can't find it, so if anyone knows where it is, that would be nice. We know from Parr's drawing that B was bearded and looking toward a youthful figure C, who has her head turned to the front. She embraces B with her right arm. The older male figure is half draped and seated on the ground with his legs to the left, while the young girl is frontal and kneeling. She wears a chiton that has fallen to reveal her left breast, and a himation draped over her right side and over her thigh. Between them and coiled on the ground is a large snake, upon which figure B rests his left hand. His right arm extends to his right, bent at the elbow, and so possibly holding a staff or a scepter. Originally, many of the subsidiary figures flanking Athena and Poseidon were thought to be divine. Yeah. Because of the existence of the snake curled between figures B and C, Michaelis identified the bearded male and his daughter as Asclepius, and the first to identify the group as Cecrops and his daughter was Weber in 1821, and this identification has stuck fairly consistently with only one exception that I'll discuss in a minute. However, Brummer called this identification, Cecrops and his daughter, quote, not an inevitable necessity, but a well-founded possibility, end quote. With the exception of the so-called Cecrops, most of the figures flanking the central scene have been only tentatively identified. Ever since Furtwängler in 1895, scholars have tried to present a clear-cut division between the two halves of the pediment. We have Athena and Poseidon flanked by their chariots in the center, and then it's figures, A to H. I don't know if you can see those letters on the left, and N to W on the right. None of them have their head, none has its head anymore. And so these figures are hard to identify. Furtwängler, just to show you some of their, argued that the figures beyond Athena's chariot on the left or north half represented the family of Cecrops, and on the right or south end that of Erechtheus. Weidauer identified those favoring Athena on one side and those in Poseidon's camp on the other. Barbet-Spaeth sees the strife of the gods reflected in the legendary war between Athens and Eleusis, with Athenians aligned on the north and the Eleusinians on the south. All of these interpretations have prompted further identifications of the figures according to the schemes which each scholar adopts. However, as I said, given their fragmentary state, the lack of attributes, and the total absence of heads, these subsidiary figures present a serious challenge to correct identification. Several new identifications, which may, on my part, which may help in the end to clarify the identity of some of the other anonymous figures, are being presented according to yet another scheme on my part, but I think one that finds confirmation in the other areas of the Parthenon sculptural program, as well as in Attic vase painting. The group BC was finally brought down from the Parthenon in 1976 and exhibited in the Old Acropolis Museum first, thus allowing scholars to study it closely and in greater detail for the first time. The front portion of this large snake, which carved separately, which you see in the lower right, resides, I guess where, in the British Museum. It's interesting that this marble fragment was described in the British Museum's inventories of 1832 as, quote, a portion of the Erechthonian serpent, end quote. I'm not sure quite what they meant by that, but in examining the tool marks, the keeper of Greek and Roman antiquities, Brian Cook, declared it to be an ancient repair, probably made in the Hadrianic period. But Olga Pelagia states that the piecing is entirely in keeping with 5th century practices, and the fragment in London should be considered original to the group. and it does fit pretty well right there. Cook concurred with all other scholars in declaring the figure to be Cecrops. Here's the back view of this group, and it shows that the man is actually sitting on top of the snake body. He doesn't, it's very clear he does not have snake legs, but he's sitting on this very large snake. The one exception is Vidauer, who, in reading this side of the pediment as the family of Erechtheus, identified the figure with a snake as King Erechtheus. I believe that her identification is correct. Sorry. For a number of reasons, the first being the most obvious here. Right, as you see here in classical art, Cecrops is never shown as a human with a snake as an attribute. Rather, most frequently, he appears anguiped to indicate his autochthony. This is a coin from Cyzicus on the right, and a plastic Gantharos on the right, or Rhiton, I should say. The many Attic vase paintings depicting the birth of Erichthonius, who I believe is the infant manifestation of Erechtheus, show Cecrops observing the scene dressed in a short chiton. I wonder if this is not so as not to scare the newborn, or to mask that kind of awkward transition between the torso and the snake. So, and his lower body is clearly ends in the snake form. A representative example is the Attic late 5th century calyx attributed to the Kodros painter. That's the scene on the at the upper part. Cecrop's name is inscribed here, and he's on the left witnessing the birth of Erichthonius. Reliefs also show Cecrops in this form, as does the Electrum coin I just showed you, without the chitoniskos on. This is a honorary decree in Athens from the Acropolis, and I think you can just see where the arrow's pointing it left to him. He's holding a fiale and the snake body at the bottom. According to numerous ancient sources, Euripides' Ion, Demosthenes, Nonus, Cecrops was half man and half snake. Apollodorus, for example, emphatically states, Cecrops, quote, Cecrops, a man born of the earth, whose body was compounded of man and snake, was the first king of Athens, end quote. Erechtheus, however, is closely associated with snakes, as is his infant avatar, Erichthonius. Pausanias, in fact, identified this large serpent tucked within the shield of the Athena Parthenos as Erechtheus. As an infant, he is guarded by snakes, as shown on this Attic red figure vase, where he sits in a basket flanked by snakes. Thus, the snake, as his primary attribute, is entirely appropriate and a clear sign to viewers as to his identity. Just as an aside here, I'm working on a virtual reality project called the Athens Reborn, and we've just modeled this new image of Athena Parthenos. I did a new reconstruction of the interior of the shield with the gigantomachy on it, but we have evidence now, 4th century BC, evidence from the Agora that the snake was originally on the other side, which allows one to see the inside of the shield and gives more prominence, I think, to the snake, who might have been larger and could have been supporting the hand of Athena. But we're going to have this in our virtual tour of the Acropolis. The second reason for identifying this figure as Erechtheus is the depiction of the young girl C, who rests her right arm on his shoulder, clearly symbolic of a familial relationship. The most distinctive feature of this girl is her bared left breast. Pelagia has stated, quote, in her book, in her monograph, which you may know, on the pediments of the Parthenon, C's bare breast is difficult to explain, she says. In her study of bare-breasted females in classical painting and sculpture, Beth Cohen concluded that, quote, bare breasts above all represent a potent visual convention employed by classical artists to denote female victims of physical violence, end quote. This is proven by numerous sculptures, starting perhaps with the famous Polyxena sarcophagus from the Troad, if you know that, to the early classical West Pediment of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, to the series of wounded Amazons, and is a convention in vase painting as well for young females who are victims of violence. So, while two of the daughters of Cecrops were driven insane by Athena and leapt to their deaths from the Acropolis, they were not subject to physical violence. The youngest daughter of Erechtheus, on the other hand, was a victim of human sacrifice, giving her life to save the city in the battle with Eumolpus and the Thracians from Eleusis. The bared breast would serve as a reminder to the viewer of her heroic action, a truly violent death for the benefit of the polis. Her presence sends a clear message to those visiting the Acropolis about the nobility of self-sacrifice for the city, once extravagantly praised by her mother Praxithea in Euripides' tragedy Erechtheus. Now, if you're convinced of this figure being Erechtheus, I will go on to some further identifications. The female figure, well, there may be one at A with the asterisk, and D here, which is missing. Maybe two more daughters or a second daughter flanking Erechtheus on his right side and his wife Praxithea to the right of C. I think D might be Praxithea. As the future priestess of Athena, Praxithea would appropriately be positioned on this side of the pediment. Remember, this is Athena's side. We have Poseidon on the other side. The reclining river god in the far left corner of the pediment, that's A, has been variously identified as one of the three main rivers of Athens, the Eridanus, the Ilissus, or the Kephissos. There he is. Because Kephissos was the father of Praxithea, and thus the father-in-law of Erechtheus, this strikes me as the correct identification, and others have identified him as such. While the Eridanus is a mere stream running through the Agora, the Kephissos is a river worthy to be depicted on the Parthenon and lies to the north of the Acropolis. And in fact, there was a shrine to Kephissos in New Phaleron, where this relief that shows him in the center with horns on his head, and there's this is the Kephissos relief, and there's another, there are two reliefs from this shrine that show that he received cult in Athens. These identifications result in a compact familial group of 5 figures on the north side of the pediment, A to D, namely the river god Kephissos, one of his granddaughters, then Erechtheus, then his youngest and most vulnerable daughter, and her mother, Praxithea. Now, there's one challenge in this argument, which is the fact that by an early account in Xenophon, the contest between Athena and Poseidon took place during the kingship of Cecrops, and thus he should be present. He is often mentioned as the judge of the contest, and as such would be close to the martyria, the olive tree and the salt spring depicted at the center of the pediment. Cecrops can be seen in one of the few post-Parthenonian representations of the contest, a fragmentary red figure Lecanus lid dedicated on the Acropolis. It's signed, you can see in the upper right, by the painter Mekion, and dated to around 400. On the upper left, you can see Athena inscribed next to her olive tree. There's some sea creatures down at the right, which are probably in the vicinity of the saltwater spring produced by Poseidon. And at the lower left, you see that scaly serpent tail. This must belong to Cecrops, and has been identified as such. If we turn to the Pelahydria, we see a similar configuration of the same event and a similar configuration of figures. This vase, if you don't know it, this was discovered in 1980 at the site of Pella, and is considerable importance as evidence for especially as evidence for the West Pediment, but also if you, I know there's something going on about Euripides, is that today? Euripides died in Pella, and I think it's sort of interesting that this vase was there. I go into that in my article. At any rate, Cecrops is shown here on the lower left. You can see him. And he is balanced on the other side by the Triton beneath Amphitrite there, and Poseidon at the left. This, as you may know, is the closest, as I say, representation of the West Pediment, or derived from the West Pediment, and it rather presciently reconstructed by Erica Simone, who put the thunderbolt of Zeus at the top of the pediment, and here it is in the olive tree. Since we know that a Triton once held up the horses of Poseidon in the West Pediment, because we have this fragment from the Acropolis of a crested tail, it is logical to see a similar creature, here an anguiped tripod, like on the Pelahydria, below the horses of Athena, namely Cecrops. And in fact, there is a viable candidate for this figure under Athena's horses. It's the so-called pillar torso, which it was found in 1835 on the ground before the west end of the Parthenon, but it is clearly shown in Carey's drawing of 1674, directly under the outermost horse of Athena's chariot. And there you see it in place. It was never placed in the old museum, they brought it out of storage, I guess, and put it up in the new Acropolis Museum. And here it is. The front of the block preserves a thick, muscular male torso, unarticulated at the back. Below its navel is a large circular break, which indicates that the figure could not have had human legs. Nevertheless, Sauer assigned the torso to the lost figure A prime, the one we think is the daughter of Erechtheus, as a seated youth. But this position is impossible because there is the mark of a horse hoof on the side of the torso. Can you see that thing? That looks like, okay. So, in there you can see the round break more clearly. In 1963, Jeppesen argued that the torso belonged to an autochthon supporting the horses of Athena. Although some scholars have questioned whether this particular piece belongs to the Parthenon, it's now positioned in exactly this spot in the new Acropolis Museum, as I just showed you. Since Cecrops is attested by later authors to be the ultimate judge in the contest, it is logical for him to be near the center, where the tokens were presumably represented. This identification also allows the pedimental composition to include the first king of Athens, Cecrops, and the equally, if not more important, king Erechtheus. The tokens produced by Athena and Poseidon were situated in his sanctuary on the Acropolis, according to Herodotus. And with the exception of Weidauer and Krauskopf, scholars have posited no older male figure in the pediment who could be identified as Erechtheus. And I just show you this. You can see in the Carey drawing at the top that torso is definitely under the horses. And some, in early reconstructions, horses need a support. So, they've posited a pillar there, which isn't very aesthetic. And, a good example, for instance, is this Lockery Acroterion, where they have put a triton under the horse. Okay, I hope I've convinced you of those identifications, and now we'll move on to the rest of the pediment. In 2005, Bettina Kreutzer suggested that the two young boys on the lap of the seated woman on the right half of the pediment up there, traditionally identified as the woman as Oreithyia and her sons Callias and Zetes, but she suggested that these might be Achamas and Damophon, the sons of Theseus, who fought at Troy. There's the torso of this from the pediment. That's the only surviving piece of that. She argued that they are on the lap of their grandmother Aethra, whose union with Poseidon / Aegeus in one of those miracles of Greek conception produced the Attic hero Theseus. So he had two fathers, Poseidon and Aegeus. Aethra was rescued from Troy. I thought I have a picture that way. I guess it's coming later, sorry. Aethra was rescued from Troy, where she was serving as the handmaid of Helen by her two grandsons, and that's shown in the North Metopes of the Parthenon. Although rare in Greek art, these sons of Theseus are shown as young boys with their mother and nursemaid on an Attic red figure skyphos attributed to the Louis painter in Vienna. Achamas and Damophon were descended from Poseidon, and they were worshipped along with other seafaring heroes at Phaleron. On the other side of this skyphos, Theseus is shown receiving a laurel branch from Athena. According to Kreutzer's reading, Theseus himself would be the seated youth S. I guess I have this in another slide. No, it's not there. S is just beyond the woman with the two children. There's a boy seated on the lap of another figure, or a young man, I should say. On the Carey drawing, he appears to be seated on the draped legs of T of indeterminate sex, lounging to the left. She argued that S and T have a familial relationship, not unlike B and C, and thus identifies T as King Aegeus with his son seated on his lap. This reading would put Theseus on the side of Poseidon in the pediment with his divine father. Theseus's close connection with his sea is illustrated by many vase paintings in which he is carried to Poseidon's undersea realm by Triton, or those in which he meets and shakes hands with his divine father, especially in the period after the Battle of Salamis. Theseus' position next to his mortal father Aegeus, his mother Aethra, and his two sons creates another five-member family grouping similar to that at the north end of the pediment. And Theseus has a relationship, although I first wrote in my thesis on Theseus that he didn't appear much on the Parthenon. I think he has a relationship with all the Metope narratives. So he obviously would fight on the Amazonomachy in the west. He was closely involved in the Centromachy in the south, and his sons were at the Battle of Troy. Now, this relates to some of my earlier work, on the Parthenon frieze, in which I highlighted two themes, which I believe are also prominent here in the West Pediment, namely the importance of Erechtheus, the warrior king par excellence of Athens, and this duality of land and sea. I've argued that the leading chariot of the Apobates race, for instance, on the Parthenon's north frieze, should be recognized as belonging to the tribe of Erechtheus. It is the tribe which is always listed first in the Athenian casualty lists, and so on a monument which celebrates Athens' victory in the Persian Wars, its eponymous hero deserves this victorious position. As for land and sea, these dualities dictated the seating plan of the gods on the east frieze, with the land divinities beginning with Ares on the south side. Flip this around. And with the land divinities, the sea gods starting from Poseidon on the north. If we return to Furtwängler's discussion of division of the West Pediment into two opposite groups, we can now posit that we have the autochthonous land heroes, represented by Cecrops and Erechtheus, appropriately located on the side of Athena, who produced the first olive tree, and the sea heroes, represented by the seafaring family of Theseus, on the other side, aligned with Poseidon. Echoing the similar arrangement of the gods on the frieze, the pediment presents the viewer with the duality of land versus sea, a contrast that is equally prominent on the Pelahydria with Athena, Erechtheus, and the hybrid Cecrops on the left, and a figure I would identify as Marathon, and Poseidon, Eumolpus, and Triton, and my hero Cecrius from Salamis on the right. As a thank offering for both Marathon and Salamis, it is only fitting that the Parthenon honor not only the gods Athena and Poseidon, but also their Athenian offspring, those literally born from the land and those more closely associated with the sea. Returning to where we began with the snake creatures on the archaic Acropolis, the Hecatopodon pediment foretells the Parthenon with its similar juxtaposition of sea and land, namely Triton on one side and the triple anguid Bluebeard on the other. It was clearly a construct that resonated with the Athenians in all periods. Thank you. Do you want me to join you at the table?
The table or at the
Okay, I just felt I couldn't see all of you if I sat there.
Thank you very much for this intriguing rereading and very stimulating interpretation of the West Pediment. I really enjoyed this lecture, and if I may, I like also this last part, the thematization of land and sea also on the West Pediment, and in connection to the pillar torso, this idea of Cecrops, I think it's very convincing, and also the position of the torso is very interesting. He's the judge, right? But he is connected to the victorious figure that is Athena, and the center has the most important judge, that is Zeus. So for this reason, perhaps the sculptor moved this torso beneath the chariot of Athena, or it's perhaps an index, it's a message to say the goddess has already won the fight. So this is the victorious part. So I think it's very, I never thought about the positioning of this figure, but the connection with the chariot and Athena is very peculiar and very specific of an episode, perhaps is a Eusteron Proteron, let's say, something announced already by the position and then announced by Zeus and the presence of the god. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I will tell you what the opposite argument is from Olga Pelagia, who of course written most on the Pediment. She said it would be ignominious holding up the horses of Athena. It wouldn't be appropriate for this great king to be, under the horse. So I would say I don't think he's really, shown the same way as the Lockery. He's under, supporting the horse like this. But it's a device on the part of a great artist to give a support without that he be kind of in front, and provide a support for the horses, but not literally. What? I'm not close enough. Did you hear me?
Yeah. I would like the students for questions. Tommaso, perhaps you have to come here since we need... No, you have the other microphone.
Thank you. Your interpretation was very charming. And I just wanted to note one thing. When you showed the Kylix of the Cordos painter, it was very interesting because it is the same mythological situation as in the West Pediment, as you presented it, in terms of temporal plans, because we have in the Kylix we have Cecrops as a snake man. We have Erechtheus as a full man, and we have also Aegeus, and so we have people from different times, different temporal plans, but they are all in the same scene because they are symbols. We are seeing the Geburt, so one of the most important mythological events in Athenian history. And so the artist wanted to sum up all these symbolical figures. And I just wanted to say it's a general pattern in this kind of iconographies, and so I think your interpretation is it's very legitimate and very, very brilliant. And also in the Pella Hydria, it's the same pattern. We have people from different times, but they can coexist because of their ideological meaning, I would say. So thank you again.
Thank you. The temporal element bothers some people when they see, all these different generations together. But if you look at many examples of this, I think there's a beautiful Rhyton in the Richmond Museum that shows all these kings of different periods, Pandion, Theseus, so they're all banqueting together, as if. So I don't think that was an issue in Greek art of combining people from different generations, the temporal aspects. I should also mention, and you know this, of course, Cecrops is represented on the frieze as an eponymous hero and human form, but it would be very weird to put him in a group of heroes in any other guise. So, and of course, we have the eponymous hero monument in the Agora. We don't know what it looked like, but presumably it was all standing figure.
Children in West Pediment. I think presence of children on the west side of the Parthenon, and the presence of children on the frieze of the Erechtheion. So this is a sort of, let's say, archaeology of the mythological history of Athens on the western pediment, related to one of the most ancient monuments on the Acropolis. So how do you see this connection? Since we have also many children on the frieze of the Erechtheion, do you see connections or not? This choice by the artist to highlight or to give prominence to this figure, since you worked also in childhood and children, how do we explain the appearance, more or less in the same chronological span, of children on two of the most important and prominent monuments on the Acropolis?
Well, the political interpretation would be that Pericles passed the citizenship law in 451 BC, which stipulated that in order to be an Athenian, you had to have an Athenian citizen father and a mother who was the daughter of a citizen. And I think it's at this point that women and probably children become more important to the, functioning of the polis and the city-state. And I believe that's the reason we have all the women on the east frieze of the Parthenon. Suddenly you have all these women, some of whom look to be married women, and there are actually 10 of them. They are in the exact same configuration, 4 and 6, as the eponymous heroes. So that's a whole other story, but I think there is something about the citizenship law, perhaps, if you want to look at it in political terms. But it's also, a movement to greater naturalism. I mean, in the 4th century, we suddenly get, this proliferation of images of children at Brauron and other sanctuaries of Artemis, who's a protector of children. And so there's some movement towards just in terms of sculptural work, or shall I say, commissions, to produce statues of children that didn't exist before. And of course, they were on grave steles as well. We have all these grave stele dedicated to children, which are expensive monuments for a child that died young. I don't know if that answers our possible questions, but family is the basis of the polis.
You're right, but also thinking about the future generation. So it's also from an iconographic point of view, if we want to give a different meaning, not only political, but also in terms of the past generations altogether, as Tommaso was saying, plus the future. The future Athenians.
Think of all the birthing scenes, not real birthing scenes, but that are depicted. I mean, Pandora's, well, she's not a child, but the birth of Aphrodite, or the birth of Erichthonius that becomes, so popular. So that showing that this child is born from the earth and part of Athens' identity. And these, scenes that didn't, we had, Athena popping out of the head of Zeus, but otherwise there are not that many birthing scenes in Greek art. So I think, there must be a greater emphasis on progeny and looking to the future and the role of these as they grow up to be citizens. Of course, that's ironic because both Artemis and Athena are virgin goddesses and don't produce children at all. And then you have a male god who does, Zeus, but I think the emphasis did change at that time.
Federico. The microphone, wait.
Thank you very much. And the identification of the first male figure with Erectonius is really intriguing. Of course, you have shown us the images on ancient vase painting when we have the birth, so the snakes flanking the box. But how can we explain the age gap between the child represented in ancient vase painting and the adult male figure in the West Pediment? So how can we explain this difference? So if we have occurrences, of course, in different media of this correspondence between this figure and snake as an attribute, for example. Thank you very much.
If I get the gist of your question, it has to do with Erectonius being a baby and Erechtheus being adult, and it's the same person. Okay, now, admittedly, there are several scholars who think that there is an Erectonius and there's an Erechtheus. And there is one vase that actually does show them both. So, but I think that, you know, it was part of this expansion of the king list and things like that, that we get this separation later. But it's very peculiar to have a figure like Erectonius who's never shown as an adult. I mean, and only a birthing scene. So I believe they're the same, one and the same. And obviously, you know from this Kekrop's vase and other things that Erechtheus has a strong, Erechtheus/Erectonius has a strong association with the Acropolis, with the snake and the Acropolis, and that scene where he's in the basket with Poseidon on one side and Athena on the other, making libations that I showed very briefly. You know, he's on the Acropolis, and he has a cult on the Acropolis. He has the Erechthean on the Acropolis. I mean, just extremely important figure. So I think his birth was important to show that he was born from the soil, and we don't have a figure named Erechtheus coming out of the soil, so I'm pretty sure that's one and the same. And they're always emphasizing this close association with Athena, the Acropolis, land, the land of Attica. And of course, he was the warrior king, the one who won the victory for the Athenians for Eleusis, over Eumolpus and the Thracians at Eleusis. And that was very important for expanding the polis. In fact, Servino Inwood's book, if you can go through the whole thing, makes a very strong case for Erechtheus being the first and original king of Athens, and that Kekrops is added later, comes later. But he is the most important, and the fact that he is a warrior king means that he does need to be emphasized, I believe, on the Parthenon, possibly the Erechthean, one would hope, because of the victories against the Persians. I mean, this is a votive monument, a votive dedication to Athena and to some extent Poseidon, but for the victory at Marathon, Salamis, Plataea. So.
Thank you.
I can imagine, the snake imagery. I mean, I would go into it more, but the scene, in the Ion where one of his tokens is a snake bracelet, bracelets, and I don't know. You can go on and on with the snake imagery and references in Athenian art and myth. It's a very potent symbol and very important.
I'd like to thank you, Professor Knights, for this enlightening enlightening presentation. And at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the earlier depiction of the strife between Athena and Poseidon, referring to other black figure pottery fragments. May you tell us more about these earlier depictions and their possible relation with the later depiction of the episode in the West Pediment of the Parthenon?
Yeah, there are two, I think it's two fragments by Clytius. I'm looking just in my notes because one which shows Poseidon on one side and on the other it shows Athena, but it looks almost like a procession. And given the juxtaposition, it's been argued that, I can't find the reference, that it might be the contest, but there's no other evidence. It's just the fact that they are shown on two fragments that seem to belong together, and there's no other explanation for the scene. But if you've looked at vases, the Maces painter and others, you'll see Athena juxtaposed with Poseidon not infrequently. So that did not convince me that was a representation. But that has been argued. I think that's the only one predating this. And I believe this is the first representation. The Parthenon invented lots of new iconography in many ways. And why does this come up now? Again, I think it has to do with Athenian naval power being increased with the increased importance of Poseidon. Athena and Poseidon share the epithet hippia, hippios, and hence I think that explains maybe the 200 plus horses on the Parthenon, this hippic interest on the part of the Athenians. So it's not surprising to find them together. And it doesn't have to be the contest. And as I say, these fragments are I'll get you the reference. I just don't have my notes at the moment. Wait a minute, I do have it.
And it is also...
Yeah, it's Servina Winwood's article in 2008 on those pieces, and then Marx wrote something in 2011. I'll give you that.
I found very interesting the connection between the fragments of the Mykion painter you showed us 400 BCE from the Acropolis in connection with, it is not so usual, not so common to have iconography depicting on pediment, let's say, on sculptures, on vase painting. Do we have other fragments or vases in connection with themes from the Acropolis, with themes from the Parthenon pediments, for instance?
No.
I think this is quite unique, and
there is that lid, Lecanus lid I showed you with the fragments, and which seems to be the birth, because Poseidon, but it could be the contest. No, I mean, it could be the contest. Because Athena's with her olive tree and whatever. No, I mean, there's a tiny red figures miniature Panathenaic that shows Athena and Poseidon in the olive tree. But in general, it's this and it's the vase in Leningrad, that shows it. Those are the only two that clearly derive from the relief vase in Leningrad. St. Petersburg, sorry. These are well known, but otherwise it's odd that it's so rare. But it comes late in Athenian iconography, vase painting kind of is petering out in the 4th century, so maybe it's not that surprising.
other comments, questions? Otherwise, we will continue the discussion outside in front of coffee or a
Thank
drink.
you. Oh, thank
And
you
I
all
would
for
like to
questions
thank
and coming
Jenifer
and
Niles,
speaking
not
in
only
English
to
on my
be
behalf.
here with us once again, but also for the mentoring activity towards my students. I
Oh,
would
no.
like to remember
I'm
what
delighted.
you did for Giovanni, for Giulio, and
Well,
Federico
you have
during
very,
the
very
stays
smart students.
in Athens, and we hope to come back to Athens next year.
hope you
Perhaps
do.
we will continue the discussion and the visit at the Parthenon.
Oh,
Thank you, Jenifer. Thank you for being with us, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Grazie a lei. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.